All right, hey guys. So it looks like most of you are all back. So we'll get started with the session. The session's largely probably just me explaining stuff, and I'll go through some demos. Yeah, I've got everything up on my GitHub page on the tutorial link as well, so it's probably advisable to kind of listen and then go to that link and then check it out and then follow that tutorial along. Cool. So my part is web APIs. And so basically what we'll be covering in the, I guess, next hour-ish, 45-minute hour, I'll be going through what APIs are, how they work, how to get started using them. And then I'll go ahead and we'll incorporate an API onto the Moodify website that we just created. And then I'll kind of touch on some next steps for next week's bootcamp. So I guess getting straight into it, what are APIs? So basically, in the general sense, you can think of it as a set of rules which help one application commonly access data of that of another application. It doesn't always have to be data, but it mainly is. And I guess if that's a little bit hard to get your head around it, you could think of it as kind of like a TV. So your application is kind of like the TV remote. That sends a request to the TV, and the TV is your API. The TV does some random things with the satellite and whatnot, and then it responds back with whatever channel you pressed. So for example, I press channel 2, the TV, aka the API, does something, and then it responds back to us with channel 2. And we don't know what exactly the TV has done, and that's kind of how an API works. So you kind of give it a request, and you don't know what it does, but it gives you something back. Yeah, so you can also get many different types of APIs. And I guess most of you are probably familiar with web APIs. But I mean, there's API use in object-oriented languages, so Java API. Many of you probably already use Java, maybe. And stuff like the file scanner and stuff like that, that's all API use. But I guess you guys probably would have thought that's maybe a bit of a class, perhaps, or maybe a library. That's an API. And then you also get library-based APIs. So stuff like Google Maps, SoundCloud. They all use a library to access their API, and that's through JavaScript. And I guess, yeah, so when I mentioned next steps just before, we'll be going through how to use a SoundCloud API later on. Has everyone here used an API before, or maybe not? Raise your hand, used API? One person, two, couple? Okay, cool. So for most of you, it's probably something new to learn. So I guess there are a lot of APIs out there, and I'm pretty sure most of you have probably used at least one of these. Yeah, and I mean, a lot of, you can actually use a lot of these services into your own apps if you were to go ahead and use these APIs. And it's through something, yeah, so it's just through an API that they use. And so I guess these are some of the features that you can do. So with Google Maps, you can get maps, you can get directions. With Facebook, a lot of it's just their authentication system. You get a whole bunch of different apps which use it. Weather, that's a pretty basic one, and TripAdvisor, yep. And I mean, there are many more APIs out there. Yep. Okay, so for this session, we'll be largely covering web APIs. And to kind of drill down more into that, we'll be using something called REST APIs. And I kind of explained that just now. So with web APIs, commonly they use it over HTTP. And the benefit of this is that it's cross-platform. So many platforms can use this protocol to access APIs or to call them. And it does it through basic HTTP methods. And I'll be going through this a little bit later. And the way they call it is through URLs. So many of you accessing a website uses HTTP. So many of you have probably already used HTTP without knowing it. And APIs or web APIs use the same thing through a web link. Now, many of you may have come across REST APIs. Some of you may have heard of SOAP APIs. You can't really compare the two, even though I've stuck that up on the slide. So what REST is it's actually like a design or architectural style, and it's not a protocol itself. So basically, what it does is it's a bit more easier to understand, which is why you'll probably come across a lot more REST APIs. And it uses HTTP, and it uses CRUD operations. And I'll go through what CRUD is a little bit later on as well. However, it's not limited to HTTP. So you can use FTP or any other protocol within question, I guess. But mainly uses HTTP. And it supports data formats, so when you get your response back, including JSON, which I'll also go through, and XML. So basically the benefit of using REST APIs is that it's lightweight and it's easy for programmers to understand. In comparison, you've got SOAP APIs. They stand for a whole bunch of things. I'm not going to go through that because it's not important. But they aren't used as much as REST APIs. And that's because it's a little bit more bulky and it's a bit harder to understand through a programmer. There are some benefits. So SOAP itself, so SOAP is a protocol. So it's not a style. So it's a protocol. It uses XML. And the reason you'd use SOAP is basically it has some security benefits, which makes it a little bit better for enterprise. So likely any of you guys use a banking app, it probably uses a SOAP API because of its security features. And yeah, they're basically bulky. So not a lot of services use SOAP, so I guess you don't have to worry about it too much. So we'll be focusing on REST. Otherwise, yeah, as I mentioned, you can import JavaScript libraries. Cool, so going down that REST API track, I'll go ahead and explain what HTTP is. So it stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. You don't have to learn that. You don't really have to even know what it means, to be honest. All you have to know is it's basically a way of exchanging data in the form of hypertext. So basically, you send a request to your web server, and it will respond to you back in this case, HTML, but it can respond in many ways. As I mentioned, CRUD operations. So REST API harnesses CRUD operations or HTTP methods. There are 4 main ones. There are more than 4, but likely with API use, you'll probably only really use these 4. So you got post, get, put, and delete. So CRUD is an acronym that stands for create, read, update, and delete. And then you can see on the table what it transferred to in the HTTP verbal method. So basically what post is it creates a new data record. So it's basically like it's like a create, essentially. You've got get. So get, all it does is it kind of just gets the data. It doesn't override or update anything. And so you'll find that a lot of APIs have many get requests, but not so many post. Or they'll have post, but it will be a little bit less common. And put, that updates the API. You generally won't get put calls in any APIs unless you create your own API. And finally, delete. And yep, as I mentioned, it will delete data. Once again, you probably won't be able to use that in any API you haven't created yourself. So yeah, basically post and get will be what you'll be using. Yeah, and get's kind of focus. So I guess most of you probably used APIs without actually programming it. You probably used an API. So I guess this was the quickest example I could find. So MSN, maybe you guys don't use it so much anymore, but the key focus is that green box, which is the weather. And so it wouldn't make sense for MSN itself to kind of have its own weather service just to show it to their user. It would make sense for them to kind of outsource that to another company and just pull their data. And so what the MSN website likely does is it sends a request to this Foraker API people, which is API provider, and then that sends a response with whatever the weather is for that city. Handler response. So what I've covered so far is kind of trying and sending a request to an API. And then the other side of that is then handling whatever the API sends back to you. So the server normally replies with a string, and it's structured data. And as mentioned, commonly used formats are XML and JSON. Yep, so I'll go through what XML and JSON are now. Some of you may or may not have used it. XML it is used, but not as much as JSON. So just a key thing to think of, JSON is generally a good focus to kind of think about. I'll go through what XML is, but you probably don't have to pay too much attention to this. So yeah, as mentioned, various ways of representing web services. The benefit of XML is that it's machine readable, but it's also human readable. So while you can kind of understand what it's kind of showing you and what it's giving you, the machine itself can also understand what's kind of going on. It kind of does look like HTML. So it uses those triangle-y brackets on the side. It's kind of tag-based, as mentioned. And yeah, it's designed to be self-descriptive. So this is what XML looks like. And it kind of looks like a tree structure. So the first line, it describes the root element. So it's kind of like your main element, which in this case is phone book. Yeah, so it's basically saying like this XML document format, well not format, but this XML document is like a phone book. And then the next thing, so entry, that's like your child element of the root. So that's saying entry 1, and then the next one after you close that tag is another entry, and so on. And then finally within that you've got more tags, or more childs, I guess, or what you would call as sub-child elements. And that's kind of your first name, your last name, whatever in this case. And those tags could be anything that you'd be subscribing. So if you wanted to say, for example, add in another tag, may address, so you just have another HTML tag, address, have your address in there, and then close that tag off. So that's XML. Now we've got JSON, so JavaScript object notation. Once again, you don't have to learn what that means in a sense, or you don't have to remember the acronym. What you do kind of have to know is it's easier to use and it's much more lightweight than XML, or lightweight alternative. Yeah, most programming languages can easily read it. It's a little bit easier to use, especially if you're kind of doing some cross-scripting in a sense. I'm not going to cover that, so don't worry about that. But yeah, it's a little bit more efficient than XML, I think. So yeah, once again, it's self-describing as well, and it's easy to understand. And it technically uses JavaScript syntax, but the JSON format is text only. And there's no closing tags either. So with XML, you notice there was closing tags. Yeah. So this is what JSON looks like. So as you can notice, instead of HTML tags is curly brackets. And the key thing to know with a JSON object is that it's key value pairs. So you'll note first name is kind of what your keys are. And then, so first name is a key, and then John, that would be your value. And so that's a key value pair. Yeah, and you can kind of have that indented. Just one thing to note, you can have arrays. So for example, if you look a little bit lower, you can see phone number. And you can have two different types of phone numbers. And so in order to capture that kind of as like a single sort of object of phone number, you can have it as an array, which is just using a square bracket, which is, I think that's a benefit of using JSON as well. Yeah. So I'll go through a demo of what an API call kind of looks like. So I'll exit out of this for now. So there's something called this, fixer.io. It's a JSON API, so it kind of gives foreign exchange rates. I thought it would be a good example to kind of use. So you'll see down here, so once again, it kind of uses that get HTTP method, and then there's your URL. And so if we go ahead and click on that, so you can see it uses JSON. And so that's your request, and then that's the data the server sends back. And so you got your key base. Yes, question? So that's one form of an API. So they have many calls. So you wouldn't have one call on your API itself. So this is just one call. And it kind of gets the latest currency for whatever they list out here. They don't have New Zealand, sadly. Oh no, they do. Yeah, $1.50. That's irrelevant though. That's just one. That's basically an API call. And they have a whole bunch of other ones. So you can see any rates from now to 1999. So you can go ahead and play around with that later on if you want to. Yeah. Okay, going back to the slides. Okay, so you guys kind of have a basic understanding of how they work. So the next part would be, where do I get started, or how do I use APIs? And I guess one of the key things is, where do you find these APIs? Because you know all your basic ones like Facebook, Google, Microsoft, whatever. But there is a website, so Programmable Web, and they have a list of all the web APIs that they know. At the moment, they've got about 15,000. So you can go ahead and you can kind of search on them and find some cool APIs. There are some really weird ones on there, but they do have documentation as well on how to use them. So if you wanted to have a look at that a little bit later on. These slides are also on the GitHub tutorial page, so you can refer to this a little bit later on as well. So for the Moodify website, we'll be using Microsoft Cognitive Services. And basically, it started off with something called Project Oxford. They have a whole bunch of machine learning APIs which kind of do some neato stuff. And then they've kind of released it to the public to use. Yeah, so like some of them can detect photos, emotions, face. They even do a bit of speech and stuff. So if I drag that web page back over. Whoop. Yep, so you can get started for free. So they've got vision, speech. So they've got some speech APIs, speech recognition, spell check. It's a whole bunch of different APIs you can use. And what kind of spun off from this was a Microsoft employee. They went ahead and they created something called howold.net. Some of you may have used this as well. So what you do is you upload a photo, and then it kind of tells you how old you are. It's not the best, but it's kind of cool, I guess. So if we go ahead and use it. I never trust their photos because they can probably just edit it and say, oh yeah, they're both 31. So we'll go ahead and use one of our own photos. So I've got Rhea. She doesn't actually know I've used this photo. Apparently she's 30 years old. I don't know if that's right or not, but I thought that's quite funny. So you can go ahead later on and kind of upload some pictures of your friends and see how old it thinks you are. Yeah, and they apparently don't keep the photo as well, so don't worry. Cool. So yeah, for our Moodify website, we'll be using the emotion API. Went through that. Okay, so some quick steps. We'll be going ahead and using it now. So three things that you kind of need to think of when using an API. First off, find the documentation on how to use it. A lot of APIs are a little bit different, even though they use the same underlying structure. So always refer to the documentation to see how to use it. As seen with the fixer, with that foreign currency API, it went through how to use it with which URL and whatever. So you find the documentation, you request the data using the URL, and then you go ahead and display whatever data it sends back to you. Yeah, so we'll be going through that. That's kind of a quick breakdown of what we'll do. So we'll choose the API, which is that emotion API. For the emotion, so one other thing to kind of go through as well. Actually, I'll go through it on another slide. Don't worry about that. So that's a brief overview of what we're doing. Cognitive services. So as mentioned, it has documentation. So as you can see, it tells you the request URL, any headers you need. So in a moment, you'll note that some APIs actually need authentication to be used. And this is so you don't abuse their services and they can kind of see who's using it and kind of what for what use. As you see, it kind of shows you how to request the API, and it goes through some documentation on how to use it. So it is, yeah, generally there's pretty good support. So as mentioned, so many APIs do use keys. So with the Microsoft Cognitive Services one, you can do 30,000 transactions a month for free, and then after that, they probably cap it off, or you can pay to have 10 transactions per second for $1.50. And this will vary between APIs. I mean, you get different APIs. Yes? Cognitive services. So like the emotion API. That's just an example. You don't need to worry about it. So with websites, you can't exactly just send the URL. You've got to do it programmatically. So we'll be doing it through JavaScript. And in order to send the request over, you need something. So what we'll be doing, we'll be using something called Ajax. Once again, you don't need to know what the acronym stands for, but basically what Ajax does is it updates parts of your web page without reloading the entire web page. So for example, you know, whoever uses Bing or Google or whatever, when you type in whatever you want to search, you'll notice a little search suggestion box that comes underneath. That itself uses Ajax. So if it didn't use Ajax, each time you type a new letter, the whole web page would refresh. And so it'd probably take you about 15 minutes just to write out whatever you wanted to do, which is why it's super important to use. Yeah. Cool, so getting straight into it. So I'll kind of just explain what the code does, and then I'll go ahead into Visual Studio Code, and I'll start adding it in. So there'll be 3 parts to sending this request through Ajax. So the first part is sending the data and the authorization token. So first part, the URL. So that's where you'd enter in your request URL. And as you noted, so with APIs that use authentication, they normally send the authentication token through something called a header, which kind of just tacks it on, so it sends the authentication token independent of whatever data you're sending. So for this case, there's 2 headers that you kind of need to send. This will vary depending on which API you use. And it will normally tell you what headers and what formatting you need to use. So the first header is the content type. So when you're sending your request through using an API, it's a good idea. Some APIs need to know what data you're sending through. So this kind of just tells the API what content's being sent through. And the second request header is your authentication token. So you've got your subscription key, and then the next pair of quotation marks that's where you'll put your authentication string in. And you normally get this string after you sign up to the API. So once you sign up to a particular API, they'll give you an API token, and then you'd go ahead and chuck that in there. And that would authenticate you over that. So the next part is type. And that seems a little bit ambiguous, but when you recall back to a little bit earlier, with APIs you get different HTTP verbs or methods, so you got to know what you're going to be sending it through. So these are your get, post, update, delete, mainly just get and post. So APIs are pretty specific in whether you send them a get or a post, and so you need to specify this as well, and so that would just go ahead in there. Next part, data, that's self-explanatory. So this is where you would chuck in the data that you would be sending to your API. You don't always have to send data. For the emotion API, because we'll be sending a photo of a face, we need to send that file to the API for it to have a look and kind of detect what emotion's being sent through. So for that, that's what we'll be sending through our photo. And this last bit here, which is process data. So what that method does is basically the data that you're sending, it can be processed into a simple string. For this case, we don't want our photo to be processed into a string, as the API won't know how to use it. So we're setting that just to false, so it keeps it into the binary format, which is a photo. There are a whole bunch of different methods you can also include when you do an Ajax call. These are the ones we only have to use for this specific API call, which is why we've done that. Anything else do we need to cover? No. Yeah, so I guess I'll go through, if you look at the before send function HXR object, so basically what that is it's an XML HTTP request object, for those of you who are curious on what it is. It's basically kind of seen as the developer's dream. And this is kind of the whole point of Ajax, because it allows the web page to be update the web page without reloading the page, and also allows to request data, receive data, and send data to a server in the background, which is why it's there. Some of you may have wondered what that is. There you go. You don't really have to know that though. So yeah, that's the part where we send the data. Of course, with anything, when you send it over the web, there's always going to be errors, or there may be errors. It's always good to kind of handle that in case there is an error that goes through. It allows the user to know what went wrong. And it's also a good chance for you to see what went wrong to help you debug. So that's the .fail method. So with this, as you can see, $.ajax, so it's a jQuery call. And if you look at the bottom, you've got curly brace bracket. And we don't have a semicolon yet because we want to keep using that Ajax call, which is why here we've got .fail. So it tacks on to the Ajax. So it says if that call fails, we've got another function, which is the error function. So here's where you'd enter in your error message to your user. So you would maybe update something onto your web page. And you can also do a console.log just to show what the error was and to help you debug it. So that's fail. And then finally, so you got this, you got the dot done. And if you go back here, you notice there's a semicolon, that's fine. So you'll notice the dot done. So this is where your response will come from the web API. And so this is where you'd go ahead, you'd, if you note there's function and then brackets data. So the data itself, the data object is what the API sends. And then you'd harness that data variable and store it to your own variables, or you'd transform it, or do whatever you need to do with it. I've kind of left this blank on this slide because it depends on which API you're using, but I'll go through how to use it for the emotions API. But this is really where you would manipulate your data from the API. So yeah, those 3 slides is pretty much all the code that you need to send a request to the API. Of course, there's some other code. So before you send your data itself, you may need to cleanse your data. And there's also some other code, such as updating the UI. However, that's independent to the API call itself. So yeah, you'll also have to keep that in mind when you send an API call. But these 3 slides are the bulk of the API call itself. Finally, API debugging. So you may code it all up, and your API may not work, and you may not know why it's not working. And it could be for a whole bunch of different reasons. It could be, is your code just bad? Being quite frank there. Maybe the request itself is just incorrect. Or perhaps you've just done everything right, and the API itself is down. And it's kind of hard to know what's going wrong if it's in your code. You could do a whole bunch of console.log statements, but that's just annoying, I guess, in a sense. There are easier ways. That's the whole point. There are easier ways. So there is something called Postman. It's a Chrome extension API, or not API, application, or a Chrome application, which you can go ahead and download. And I will show you what it looks like. Yeah, so that's pretty much the bulk of my slides. So I'll go ahead and show you some stuff now. So if I exit out of that. So what we'll do now is I'll go ahead and send a request to the Emotion API using Postman, so you can kind of see what the headers look like, what the body looks like, what the API itself responds with, and then we'll go ahead into Visual Studio Code and then add that Ajax call into there. Okay, cool. So this is what Postman looks like. I've got a link to download this on the Git page as well. Yeah, so this is pretty much just your main thing here, which you'd be using. So you can see here is your HTTP methods. As you can see, there are a whole bunch, and there's your main ones there. So you get, post, put, and delete. You'll pretty much just be using those top 4. Your API will specify, as mentioned, which one to use. For the Emotion API, they want to use post. Over here, this is where you'd be putting down the URL. So I've got the URL just here, so we'll chuck that in. As mentioned, if you need authentication, you need to chuck that in the headers. And you can see here, so you've got a section for your headers. You've got your key and value. Now, when you're sending through headers, they are very specific. So if you spell them wrong, or if you type them out wrong, it just won't understand what the headers are, and your API call will fail. Your API will specify what the key needs to be. So if you recall back to the slides, you've got one key, which is your content type, which is that, and it has to be exactly like that for this API call. So for example, if I were to perhaps do that, or maybe exclude the hyphen, it probably wouldn't work. And for that, we would need this. So your API would specify this, so don't worry if you don't know what it is. So that's that. And then once again, you've got your authentication key. So there's that. And as I mentioned, when you sign up to your API, you'll get a key. In this case, that was the key. It will be different for everyone. And some APIs don't even need headers. So once again, refer to your API documentation. Now for your body. So you got your headers sorted, but now you need to send your API some data. Well, in this case, it needs data. Some of the APIs don't need data. You've got a whole bunch of different ones. So you got raw, which you could send your API JSON data, or you got binary. Binary in this case will be our photo. So we can go ahead and choose a file. I've got this smiley face guy here. So I'll go ahead and just add that in there. And that's pretty much it for what we need for this emotion call. So if I go ahead and click send, you can see it's sending the request, and there you go. So it kind of worked. And so this is the response we got back from our web server, or Microsoft Cognitive Services. So you can see it's in JSON, and you can see there are two objects. One is like a face rectangle, so it kind of measures out the face. And then you've got scores here. So with the emotion API, it detects a whole bunch of different emotions, such as anger, disgust, fear, and the photo that I used, I'll just go back to that, which is this guy here is very happy, supposedly. And then as you can see over here, happiness is 1, which means that guy was happy, or it detected that guy to be happy. And that's that, yeah. Now you may be wondering, what happens if we send a photo of not a person? And don't worry, I got you guys covered. I got a photo of something that's not a person, so we'll go ahead and the scenery photo, we'll go ahead and use that. And I called it phase 3 just in case you guys thought, oh yeah, it probably just reads whatever the file name is. So if we go ahead and send that, see, it doesn't actually send you back with anything. Normally it sends something called, it would have said something that it doesn't detect a face. For some reason it didn't say that, but there you go, it didn't reply with anything. So yeah, that's Postman. So that's pretty much a good way just to debug your API call modularly away from your code. And yeah, what might be interesting is if I go ahead back onto this, we'll try this one here. So that's the API call itself, and you can see it uses a get HTTP method. So if we go back onto Postman, go get, send in that request, and if we go send, you can see it replies back with the info as well. And remember, this time we didn't actually use any headers, so some APIs don't need headers. Cool. So that's that. So we know that our API call works and that everything's all good. So we'll go ahead and chuck that onto Visual Studio Code. It's probably best if you guys kind of watch and see what I'm doing. The only reason is with the Moodify website, there's a whole bunch of other code that you need to put in before you add in your API call and the Ajax call. So what this other code does, and it's on the Git, so that's why you guys, if you guys listen now, you guys can go back to the Git page and then follow the tutorial there, and it has the extra code in it. What this extra code does is it checks the file format, so it makes sure that you're sending a photo, because you may send something else. So checks for PNG. Also, this other additional code, what it does is it handles the response from the API, and then it does some things to update the web page. So that this tutorial doesn't cover that as such in this, me presenting it. So I'll go through just with the Ajax call, and if we have some time, I'll go through what the additional code does. Okay, so you'll notice some of this has some additional code, but if we go back to index, so you'll see this is what you guys should have at the moment, just your standard index.html page. And I do have my web server running, so I can go ahead and open what that looks like. So Moodify. So this is where you guys should be up at the moment, and if we go ahead and upload a photo, it does absolutely nothing. I took away that alert just because I thought that was useless for this case. So as you can see, the website does absolutely nothing at the moment. So we chuck in that API call, and we'll see what happens. And remember, there is additional code, which is why when I chuck the Ajax in, it will work. So just have that in mind. So minimize that. Ajax demo. So this code here is exactly the same as what was on those slides. There'll be some extra things in there, so you can see I've actually filled out my headers. So I've got my API key there again. I've got content type and the subscription key. I filled in that it's post. Data tape file. So going back to the basic thing here, there is, yeah, so once again, this is some of the additional code, so you may not have this, but when we are picking the file, we basically got a file reader, so when the user selects their photo, it stores that file to a variable called file. So if we go back to our Ajax there, so we're sending that photo file, and remember we want to send the file itself, not the string, which is why we've got process data sent to false. After that, we've got our .done method, which is handling the API response. Now, the key thing is you would essentially want to refer to the API documentation or Postman before you do this part. And the reason is when you get the data object itself, you will be getting, if I send that again, so you'll be getting this, right? And you'll be getting that as, what it was, the data object. And so you've got to know what the keys are in order to be able to refer to them, or the objects itself. So we've got face rectangle and we've got scores. And so if we go back to our code, in order to use the scores and be able to harness what emotions were sent back, we need to store the scores part of the data, which is why when we go back here, you can see first I just do a check to make sure that there is some data in there, because if there's no data, we know that it obviously wasn't a face. And then you notice there, so you got data and you got 0, which is basically all that data, and then we've got dot scores. And so the dot scores refers to that scores key version, part of the API response. And so this here, that stores your anger, your happiness, your disgust, whatever. You can all ignore this. This was just me testing some things out. And now you may be wondering, for those of you who kind of know a little bit of JavaScript, why I'm using let scores rather than variable scores. I could have used variable scores. Basically what let does is it just encapsulates scores into this little block here. Variable makes it a little bit more extensible, but it doesn't matter really. And then so after I've got the scores part, I then send that back up. And basically, just going back here, if there's no data, I just say we can't detect a human face. Finally, remember there's error handling. And so as I mentioned, it's good to tell your users what kind of went wrong or why something hasn't appeared. So I've just changed the inner HTML to say something went wrong and try again. And then, as I mentioned, it's kind of good to log it for yourself so you can see yourself what went wrong. And that's the call itself. And I've encapsulated it into a function so then I can make it modular and I can just call it in my JS. So we'll go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And we'll go over here and add in the call here. So that's the call there. And there is one more thing. All right, and I've just got this here because it just says, it's also good, so when you're sending your request, it's also good to let your users know that a request has been sent or that something's happening. If you remember when I uploaded a photo just earlier to the Moodify website, it did absolutely nothing. It didn't even say that your photo was uploaded, which is why I'm going to add this line in here saying that once you've uploaded a photo, it's been taken. So if we go back to the website and I do a refresh, cool, browser sync. So I'll go ahead and upload a photo again. I've got smiley face guy. See, it's saying I'm analyzing your mood. And then we got our response back saying the mood's happy. And I got an emoji there. So this here is that additional code. So we need additional code to then respond it back to the website. If you want an emoji or smiley face or whatever, you would also need to code that up. I've got some other photos here as well, just to show you that it's not hard-coded. So I've got photo here. He's not very happy. I think that's actually David Cameron, for any of you know. I don't know. Cool. And yeah, your mood is sad. So there you go. And I just realized I've got Ria's photo as well. So we'll see, is she happy or what's going on there? So we'll just use that as well. Oh, okay. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, you need to have some file checking to make sure you send the right photo. I've only got JPEG or PNG enabled. I'll just change that to see if it works. Actually, I'll change the file. I'll do it this other way, or I'll just change the file name. I think it's funny. Rename. JPG. Yeah. Okay. Let's website. Okay. Upload picture. There we go. Oh, you're happy. Is she happy in that photo? I don't know. Let's have a look.
That's a creepy photo.
She is happy in the photo. Okay, cool. So, yeah, so you can have a bit of fun there. It looks like we've got 5 minutes left, so I'll go through that extra code really briefly. I've documented it on the GitHub page, so you can go there. It explains what all the additional code does, and then it goes through and explains what the Ajax does and everything. So hopefully by following that, you'll be able to get your Moodify website to be doing this. One thing to note is you'll need that API key. So if you want to do this, you'll have to go to the Microsoft Cognitive Services website and to sign up for an API key. That's pretty simple. I mean, you just go to the website and just click Get Started for free, and it will tell you to sign up and let's go and just follow those prompts. The web link is on the slides as well, so just refer to the slides. I'll just go through the additional code section. I'll go through the GitHub page, aka.ms/module 2. So yeah, I got some definitions. So yeah, I've got some instructions on how to use Postman. There's a link to Postman there. So yeah, setup, external logic. So as mentioned, you need to check that there's a photo file. So you need to check if it's PNG, JPEG, or whatever, simply because you don't want someone to upload like a gigabyte application file and send that through. So I'm going to set up emojis as well. So when we want to update our website to show what the user was feeling. So for that, I was going to use emojis, and I was going to say they're happy. And there's also another thing. So if you remember to the API response we got, it said different numbers. So if you're happy, it did 1, and it had different levels using decimal places. Bring it back up there. So you can see here, there's a bit of disgust and there's a bit of neutralness. And so you kind of need to, for this example, you need to determine what the main emotion was. And so we actually need to code that up onto our website as well, or our JavaScript, to know what the main emotion was. So you can see this is all stuff that is independent to the API. So it's independent to the API call itself. But in order to use the data that you get from the API, you need to do all this external logic as well. And to be honest, the external logic is probably a little bit more harder than the API call itself, because the API call is generally always using the same format. You just change your URL and the HTTP method. Yep, so that's just some prologue as well. So if you want to add it in, there's just some things like this you need to do to it. Because if you want to change specific parts of your website, to refer to them, because we're using jQuery, you need to convert it into DOM objects. This is all explained in that. So number 1, file checking. So I've got another function here. What it does is it gets the file, which you just click and upload it. It stores it to the file variable. What I do is then I chuck it through something called a file reader. And what I do is I use it to read through the file, and I make sure that it is a valid file and it's not corrupt. Otherwise, I just say it's an invalid file. Once the file has been loaded up onto temporary storage, I then go ahead and do a check just to see that it's JPEG or PNG. And if it's not, so you got your not Boolean thingy there, expression, I guess, it just says please. So I give feedback to the user saying please upload a PNG or JPEG, as you guys saw. However, if it's all sweet, then I just give it a callback to file, which is then used by the API. Next thing, so remember after you get your response back, you need to kind of handle your response. And so for this, well, I've set up something called a mood object in a sense. And what this does is it stores what the mood was, which is happy, sad, angry, whatever. And I've just set up an emoji URL because I'm just referring to a picture of an emoji, really. And so that's setting up the object. And then there we go. I'm initializing the objects here. So for happy, I've got happy, and then I've got the link to a happy face. So if I go here, happy face. So that's basically what the website does there. After that, so remember back to Postman, you get different states of how happy you are and stuff. So just for a quick demo, what I did was if the happiness score is more than 4, then you know the person's happy. Else if sadness is up more than 4, whatever. And as you can see, I'm referring to scores.happiness or scores.sadness. And this refers back to this here, which is scores.happiness, scores.sadness. So referring to the data object that's replied from the API. In a practical sense, you wouldn't do it like this. What you do is you would rank all the scores, you would find what was the highest score, and then you would use that. To be honest, I really just couldn't be bothered doing that because it's a bit involved, so I just did it like this. That's bad programming, just saying. The last thing you need to do, so after you've kind of done that logic, you need to then tell your user what's going on. So I've got another function here, which is change UI. This is what says your mood is, and then whatever the mood is, and it refers to that mood object. So current mood.name, and then I've got, this just links to that photo, so it shows the photo, and that's pretty much it. So as you can see, the logic itself, it gets a bit complicated when you're trying to show your users what's happening, but the API call itself is just a bunch of lines here. And then after that, you just need to link it all together. So if you look on your own code, you should see something called imageSelector.on, which is that image selector button event. And then we'll just go ahead, and I'm just adding in the process image function that I just talked about, the send emotion request, which is the Ajax call. And then I've got this get current mood, which then uses whatever data is sent through, and I see what is the predominant emotion. And then lastly, I've got the change UI function, which then sees, which then updates the web page to whatever emotion was shown in the photo. And then you're done. So that's that. So we're almost done with this section here. I'll just return back to my PowerPoint. Done that. So yeah, so as you can see, it's quite easy to use web APIs, logic a little bit harder. Next steps. So essentially what we want to be doing with this is we've seen that there is an emotion with a photo. But I mean, anyone with eyes can kind of see that a person's happy or they're sad or whatever. So we kind of want to go ahead and do something with this. And with some APIs, you can access them through libraries or an SDK. So think of that as things like Google Maps or Bing Maps or whatever, music players such as SoundCloud, or video players like YouTube. So yeah, many companies provide these libraries which you can then import into your own web app.